Look, originally I was going to give a speech that was going to be incredibly depressing and super philosophical, and I'm not going to do that. So I'm also a public speaking teacher, and you got to feel the temperature of your audience, and I don't think that's the right thing to do right now. So I'm going to instead just kind of make up a speech on the fly, using like two of my slides. So we'll see how that goes. Don't blame me if this really sucks. As I've been listening to everybody tonight, I've heard a couple of common themes, and one that really touched me, and this is not to pick on one of my own students, but just because I teach her and I know her, was Lenny's presentation, which I thought was incredibly authentic. It was touching to me because I know her from class and she never speaks. Like, those are the most words I've ever heard her speak in 2 years, like all together. It was really quite remarkable, so it was really touching. And to hear her speak about how scared she was about growing up in a world where perhaps she was going to be insignificant. Perhaps her life wasn't really going to matter. And what do you do to make sure that that doesn't happen? And even though I'm becoming an old man, I'm not so old that I don't remember that feeling myself when I was in high school. That feeling of, my gosh, what does it take to actually stick out in the world? What does it take to be somebody, to be remembered? And what I've heard from a lot of people who've also expressed this fear tonight, from adults, from students alike, is that if somehow I can be like super active, if somehow I can just really motivate myself, I can overcome it. I can bend the world to my will. It's a very Nietzschean sort of perspective. I will make the world do what I want it to, because I will impose myself on it. And some people can do that, and it's an amazing quality. It's an incredible thing when you meet one of these people who are actually that powerful, who are actually that willful. They have that much will. They want to bend the world, and they can. And we do see examples of them all the time. We see examples in social media, these people like Beyonce and LeBron James, and, you know, making themselves into these giant media phenomena. It's incredible to see something like that. And ladies and gentlemen, please don't think I'm a jerk. That's probably not going to happen to you. And this is not to break your dreams, and this is not to be some kind of horrible person, but that comes from a certain type of capitalistic model that produces about a couple hundred billionaires, and it produces about 8 billion poor people, as other people talked about tonight in that beautiful speech about billionaires. We're still using billionaire capitalistic thinking to motivate ourselves and to motivate each other about how we should go about life. And I'm not sure that that's a really good model for us to be using. And I'm completely complicit. You know, I tell my kids, work harder, do more, get better grades. It's absolutely ingrained in the way that we go about life with each other, the way that we interact with each other. We motivate each other. We say, yeah, you can do it. And really what we're doing is setting ourselves up for failure. There's different modalities of being. And by that, I mean there's different ways of being in the world. We do all of these things all of the time. We can be active. We can be doing stuff. We can be passive. We can just be watching things. This is things that we like to do as well. We can be passively active, which means that we're sort of putting things off. We're not ready yet to do something, but we want to be doing something, but we're not. It's that uncomfortable space that particularly students find themselves in like 99% of the time. Teachers do too, but don't tell anybody. Or we can be actively passive. We can be really open to what's going on around us. My proposal to you would be is that we've all been kind of told this story, that unless you're over at this side of this spectrum of being, unless your being in the world is being very active, you're not a good person. You're not contributing. You're not going to have a very meaningful life. However, I would suggest to you that maybe that's completely untrue. It's probably really true for like 1% of people, or maybe 0.1% of people, but it's not true for most of us. I would suggest that actually meaning comes at the other end of that spectrum, when we're not actually doing anything, but we're ready to listen. When we're ready to listen, when we're actively passive, things can come to us. And I would say that rather than find meaning by creating your own story, molding the world, and bending the world to your will, perhaps try to be more aware of what the world is telling you. How is it actually affecting you? And I know this sounds a little bit like Eastern philosophy, because it is. It's the idea that perhaps in anticipation, rather than domination, we can get more out of life. You know, there's this cycle that goes on. We try to be active. We're in a dominant mode. Then we're not as dominant as we'd like to be. We resign ourselves. Then we might get into this idea of passive activity, ready for the next thing. And then we're in that state that we hate as actively passive, putting things off, a feeling of disease. That's what Western culture calls it. But the long story short, all I want to say to you tonight is maybe finding meaning in our lives isn't about creating meaning. Maybe it isn't about actively going out and searching for it, but actively sitting back and watching what's going on around us. That meaning doesn't come from me, but it comes from something that's beyond me. Because this was going to be the sad part of my speech, but I'm not going to talk about it. Because when true tragedy happens in our life, the meaning that we make up for ourselves, the story that we've given ourselves is not enough. It falls apart. If there's not something truly transcendent, something that you didn't make up, and you know you didn't make it up, that's why it's meaningful. That's what actually helps us through incredibly difficult times in our lives. But we only find that if we're listening, if we're truly paying attention, rather than telling the world what it's supposed to be, rather than trying to dominate it. Last thing I'd like to say is never underestimate your ability to mess up your own project. It's a super important thing in life. We're incredibly blind to the exact things that we should be paying attention to in case we want to go forward with anything. But certainly when we're trying to look for meaning in our lives. And I'll tell you a quick story to end on, hopefully with a laugh, and then we can all get out of here, because I think the security guards are leaving now, and it might be getting dangerous outside. So I remember back to when I was in university here in KU Leuven, and I studied philosophy. And the way that classes worked here in Leuven was you had like an hour of lecture, and then you had a little break. Everybody went out for a cigarette. Everybody smoked, even the professors, and that was like a time to talk to each other. You know, philosophy, you have to smoke. You come back in, and you had like 10 minutes to ask questions, and there was like another hour of lectures, but that 10 minutes was it. So that was super precious time that you had to, everybody was like in contention, vying to be noticed. I want to have my question. And, I was always trying to ask a question, but these questions weren't really questions. These were like grandstanding opportunities. This is a moment for you as a student to prove to all the other students and to the teacher how well you've been paying attention and how smart you are. And so I remember this one particular class, I raised my hand, nobody looked at me. There was this guy in the back from Seattle with bleach blonde hair, and I hated his guts. He was so cool. He had Nirvana shirt, and And anyway, the teacher called on him. I was like, dang it. And what is your question? I had Belgian teachers, but this particular Belgian sounded like he was from Romania. What is your question? And the guy from Seattle in the back, he looks up and says, yeah, well, Professor, I thought it was really interesting what you were saying about Lacan, because it actually reminded me of like an anti-Antigone story where you could actually reinterpret and recast the characters in light of Freud's Oedipal complex. And the anger was building inside me listening to this jerk spout off all of these cool things that he's read, impressing everybody, impressing the professor, my blood was boiling. And then I had a little bit of relief when the professor shut down this student in the most epic way I've ever seen And one day I want to do this to a student, but I haven't disliked a student this much yet, but maybe one day it'll come. And so the professor says, "Thank you. Your question is not entirely stupid, but for reasons you don't understand." I loved it. I was so happy. And I went home that night, and I really thought about it. I was like, why am I so angry at that guy? Why am I so mad? And when I really had some time for some active passivity and listened to myself and listened to what was going on inside myself, I realized I was angry at him, not because he was super different than me, but because he was me. He was a side of me that I was not yet willing to accept was part of me. That part of me is an arrogant jerk in the back of the class who wants to get noticed and wants to use big words. I didn't want to accept that. I don't think of myself that way, but I am. And when I actually made that realization, there was still a lot of anger, but then I was able to let go of it. I was able to have a little bit more empathy, both for that person, but for a lot of other people that I thought I hated. Just, I would say, remember, as you go forward through this journey, trying to figure out how to make our lives meaningful, never forget to inspect yourself and look at the things that really upset you. Those are your blocks in life, and ask yourself, where are you in that block? And if you can accept that, that might be the most meaningful step you have towards moving forward. Thank you all very much for coming tonight. Really appreciate everybody's patience, and thank you all for coming from so far, putting so much work into tonight. Thank you. Have a good night.